Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this late morning, early afternoon. As always, we are just so grateful for your time and energy in the middle of your day, during your lunch, hopefully your lunch break. We're really excited for the conversation that we have for you. And so we're going to get started in a moment. I'm just going to do our stolen land and stolen labor acknowledgement that we've started to do here at Urban Homeworks. So at Urban Homeworks, we acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that European colonizers stole from the Dakota peoples, indigenous to Minnesota. For this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We also acknowledge that we live our lives and do our work on land that was cultivated and developed by bodies that European colonizers stole from West African countries through the transatlantic slave trade. In order for this theft to occur, sadistic acts of genocide, rape, and forced assimilation were employed. We acknowledge what was taken from our collective human ancestors, and as we do so, we commit to work and fight for the liberation of the descendants of those enslaved through American chattel slavery and the sovereignty of all Native peoples. Thank you. My name is AsaleSol Young. I'm the executive director here at Urban Homeworks. And today I'm excited to introduce you to two guests. One from the American Indian Community Housing Organization, Daryl Olson, who is the Director of Programming, and our guest from Little Earth, Cathee Vick, the Housing Advocate and Program Manager. Cathee and Daryl, I'm going to also let you introduce your work. And Cathee, we'll go ahead and start with you. Tell us about the work that Little Earth is doing.
Well, I have been with Little Earth since January, and I came to them through AmeriCorps, really, because of the pandemic. I'm an independent Indian housing consultant that's HUD approved, and so I've traveled the nation working with different tribal communities and reservations in all aspects of Indian housing, whether it's an Indian Housing Authority or department. Focusing on homebuyer education, credit counseling, organizational development. And so when I came to Little Earth on a program, we ended up marrying this program, and they offered me a position here while still being a consultant throughout the nation, which is nice. So when travel starts to pick up, I'll be able to still do my consultant work with tribes that I've previously worked with. But we're focusing on, when I came here, it was how do we prevent eviction? Because we have 212 units, over 1,200 people, over 38 tribes that live here. It is like an urban reservation. And so we really wanted to focus on preventing eviction because it's become such a challenge to find housing, especially affordable housing. And then with an eviction on the record, it really makes it even more so challenging. So we focused on that, and that was really, we collaborated and talked about how can we do this? So it's meeting with, one of the ways that we're doing it is I'll be handling all the new resident orientation. And so they get to come in and sit with me. I get to go over extensively the lease, go over the house rules and how to be compliant and how to become a successful renter. I know that HUD on September 28th put out a press release that for FHA loans, they were also going to include a 2-year successful rent history in scoring for home ownership, for credit scores, for banks. So it just came at a perfect time because this is what we're focusing on, helping people to really understand that from becoming a new resident. Then also part of that is current residents. So I handle all the housing complaints that if there's lease infractions or that type of thing, and they call Little Earth Residents Association, we're an advocate for our residents. I can help mediate. So there is still accountability on the residents' part, but also help them and gain the understanding and the mediation within the management office. And it's been working really, really well. But this is really just brand new for that we're doing this. Officially, we started August 28th. And so I'm excited to see what the next few years does.
Yeah, that's really amazing. And it feels like really perfect timing to have this panel for you to kind of delve into the details of what is underfoot. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Daryl, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce your work at American Indian Community Housing Organization.
Perfect, thank you. So again, I'm Daryl Olson. I'm the Director of Programming at AICHO, which I'll use for short instead of saying the American Indian Community Housing Organization 20 times. So AICHO originally started in 1993, and it actually started in a parking lot outside of a social service agency in Duluth, Minnesota here. And it was really a conversation between community members about why our community didn't have resources, we didn't have any community spaces, we didn't have services that met our cultural needs. And so we really looked to the urban Native community to help us design this Indigenous response to all the social conditions that were affecting our community. We started with very basic needs. Our first program was a domestic violence shelter called Dabanugan, which is still running at this time, and we are looking at expanding it, and then looking at housing supports. And this kind of, in the last, I've been here since 2013. So in the last 10 years, we've really had this ongoing work to change systems and really look at the real issues that impact our community. You know, violence, housing, and economic inequity, trauma, historical trauma and racism. And so we have a continuum of resources. We don't just do housing, we do supportive services, we do domestic violence, we do legal advocacy, we have a climate and cultural resiliency initiative, as well as social enterprises and youth programming. And one of the big aspects of AICHO's programming is we use art and culture as a catalyst within our services to promote healing. Excuse me. Since the pandemic started, though, a lot of our work pivoted. A lot of our work started looking at health equity, the response and recovery of the COVID pandemic, and those that were hit the hardest, which are BIPOC and Native American community members. And so that the last 3 years, we have been working with the Minnesota Department of Health to do outreach and health-related work in underserved communities, both in the local St. Louis County area and statewide as part of the COVID Community Coordinated Program with MDH. So that's just a little bit of background on AICHO. I could spend the whole hour talking about each program, but that's just a little snippet for everyone.
Beautiful. Thanks so much for that, Daryl. Appreciate you as well being with us today. So our focus is largely on housing for this discussion, and obviously your work, both of your organizations, digs much deeper into various aspects of systemic injustice and working to create equity within your communities. But as we focus on housing, I think our audience would really value hearing from you about the most significant barriers and challenges that you all are working to address as you work with people to access equitable and dignified housing. I'm going to start with you for this one, Daryl.
Sure. Well, just to speak on locally Duluth, in general, we're kind of at ground zero with high poverty. Nearly 65% of natives in Duluth are living at or below poverty level, which compared to 22% of the entire population. We make up only 3% of the city's population here in Duluth, but we make up 30% of the homeless population. Traditionally, you know, Indigenous women have been key economic and decision makers in our community. And that was hit hard, not just by colonization, but, you know, the new gender norms and the unbalance in community power. In Minnesota alone, 80% of American Indian mothers are the primary breadwinners in the family. And this is part of the context that really drives AICHO. Within all of our housing support programs, some of the significant barriers, obviously, this is nationwide, is the lack of affordable housing. And it's not just a lack of affordable housing, but it's safe housing. I work with a lot of different housing providers and landlords that don't provide adequate and safe housing, but are able to keep renting to individuals that are underserved or in poverty because that's what they can afford. And that's a huge barrier. So access to housing, we don't have enough housing in general. I always look at housing as health. And I'll explain that a little more, why I say that. You know, our health disparities, our economic disparities, our education disparities are all linked to stable housing. You know, AICHO is driven off a housing first model, which basically means, and I ask this question all the time doing interviews for staff, is, you know, what is housing first? I mean, it's very simple. You house individuals first with no limitations to what barriers they're coming in, whether it's their criminal history, whether it's mental health, whether it's addiction. You need to house an individual and meet their basic needs before you can start to delve into any type of barriers or trauma or offer that support. And I think that's the biggest thing that people miss, is it's not just about housing individuals, it's about supporting them in stabilizing and looking at that long-term housing stability. I also am the property manager for all of our housing properties here in Duluth. And I've been doing that role now since 2016. And partly why I took on that role and why AICHO requested from our funders to take on self-managing is because we were working with an outside property management company. And our vision and mission for our community did not align. Most property management companies are very black and white. They're about profit, they're about rents getting paid. We know that there's a lot more to permanent supportive housing and stable housing than just rents getting paid. And so we took it over in 2016, and I like to talk about property management in a way of it being trauma informed. And this word is thrown out there all the time. What does trauma informed mean? And for AICHO, it really dives into meeting our tenants at where they're at. There's no expectation of them to participate in services, but we've kind of walked alongside them in that journey. Whether they come into housing and are looking to increase their education or increase their income, or maybe they are just trying to reconnect to their heritage and their cultural ties. And so we really allow our tenants to lead what's next in that process for them, and to address some of those barriers. There's a lot of systematic barriers that our communities face when looking into housing and just resources in general. And depending on the community in which you live in, those things are compounded by the historical trauma and the racism. And Duluth is one of those places where it historically, among many others, has been very, very racist, very segregated. And, you know, we have tribal communities from all over the country that have come to Duluth, and reservations from all over that are coming into housing, specifically at AICHO as well. And so looking at how do we meet the needs of these tribal community members who are living here in urban Duluth, but still have that connection to their home, and still are directly affected by the barriers that are affecting their families and their communities back home. The other barrier that I just have to bring up is the whole coordinated entry system within our communities. That system is very intrusive in the assessment of community members of all backgrounds. It negatively affects victims of violence within their scoring for housing. And, you know, there isn't enough housing, there isn't enough vacancy in housing or housing available for that system to work correctly. And it is never going to work correctly in that essence, unless we start investing in building more affordable housing. And I say that because I look at our local St. Louis County coordinated entry statistics pretty regularly. And it is appalling to me that we have elders who are 65 and older that have been on this waiting list for 2 years and are still homeless. You know, we have close to 2,000 people on our coordinated entry waiting list in just St. Louis County. And to me, that's a failure on all of us to do that. We have women and children, we have singles, we have veterans, and we have our elders who are sitting on this list and are given a number, expecting that is going to help them move forward. And it's really not. And I think it creates its barrier in itself because we are required, most housing agencies who receive HUD funding are required to pull through that coordinated entry system. And that timeline or that process from pulling an application to actually filling a unit, when I first started filling my units on my own, I could fill them within 30 days. Now it's 3 to 4, sometimes 6 months to find somebody who's eligible through that system. Meanwhile, we know there are 2,000 plus households sitting on this waiting list, and I have a vacant unit here that could have been filled, 4 months ago. So I think that is another tremendous barrier within our communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, Daryl. That was incredibly comprehensive. So really appreciate the detail there. And we do see a lot of similarities here in the Twin Cities around who is able to provide housing to low-income families, and the lack of affordable and dignified opportunities, the lack of development. A lot of our development is targeting middle-class folks, single-family buyers, home buyers, and things like that. So very similar issues occurring in both Duluth and the Twin Cities. And of course, Cathee, I want to give you a chance to respond as well. So I will restate the question in case that is helpful, but just asking about the significant barriers and challenges that you see for folks accessing equitable, dignified housing within the Little Earth community.
Daryl really gave a clear picture of what we experience here, specifically in the coordinated entry system. And I didn't become familiar with that until I started here in January, and really have found that it is a barrier in itself, and really it's unbelievable to me to when you're assisting folks in trying to find affordable housing, and this is the route that we have to take in order that you're homeless. And then another barrier here in Minnesota is or in Minneapolis specifically, is the definition of what it means to be homeless. That's a significant barrier. If you are fortunate enough that you have a friend or a relative that will let you stay on their couch, you are not considered homeless, and won't even be put into the coordinated entry system, are allowed to be assessed through that system. And so it's morally so disparaging for a person like myself, because I find myself, I'll lie. I would lie that you got to say you don't have a couch to sleep on. You know, I don't see any other way, even though I have to let them know that getting in the coordinated entry and being assessed through that system doesn't guarantee anything. And that's stated right in the get-go. It doesn't guarantee you're going to get housing. Not in 1 year, not in 2 years, not ever. So everything that Daryl said, she said it so well and beyond how I could express. And so I thank her for all the work that they're doing there. But yeah, I think one of the biggest barriers is the coordinated entry system and the definition of what it means to be homeless. Of course, the investment of building and developing housing for folks. And, you know, so that's about what I could say.
Yeah, thank you for that, Cathee. Really appreciate just your honesty around that issue that you experience, your community facing. And I would love to just hear, you know, what are things that would be helpful in bypassing that system, right? And navigating around that system. What are things that organizations can do, that partners can do to help actually get folks housed and get them housed with dignity? And Cathee, I'll go ahead and let you continue.
You know, that's a really complicated question in what can we do now? And what can folks help us to do to open this up for people to receive housing? I can't answer it. I don't know. I just don't know. I'm too new in this aspect of housing. And so I apologize for not being able to give you a clear picture of how we could help, other than changing the laws or changing the rules of this coordinated entry and or the definition of what it means. Because I know that in other counties, in Hennepin County, the definition is one thing. And then if you go into Ramsey County, it's different. So, you know, changing the rules of what it means to be homeless here in Minneapolis, that would be one way. Even with that said, it still doesn't change the fact that the coordinated entry system is not set to succeed to help anyone except for the people who work at coordinated entry. It gives them jobs, but it doesn't help anybody. I haven't seen, now I've only been doing this for 11 months, but I have not had one success from coordinated entry that I can say, yay, we found you housing. It's really, everybody sends everybody to me. Well, Cathee's the housing specialist, get her in there. And it's so disparaging. It's so hard to say, gee, I don't have all the answers, but I can help you along this system. But I have to be honest, it's broken and it's, you know, so I don't know what we do, but I'm here for the conversation.
Absolutely. And I think, Cathee, your answer is the answer, is that we need to honestly look at these systems that are, and for some of us, really working the way that they were always intended, which was to not work for those that need these systems the most. And to be honest about that and rewrite them. I'm going to open this conversation up to you as well, Daryl. And if you guys can just keep both of them spotlit for this next piece, that would be great. As you respond, Daryl, I'd love for you to also just speak to the ways that the kinds of partnerships that would be helpful as you are seeking culturally responsive housing or to house folks in culturally responsive settings. What kinds of partnerships would benefit your work?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, Cathee, your response is dead on. We have to start looking at the systems. We have to start looking at who is designing these rules, and specifically to coordinated entry, the assessment. You know, the VI-SPDAT is actually not a 12-page assessment. It's much more than that. It goes into each one of those areas of living and stability, mental health. And so we're only getting a glimpse of that, but those questions are so intrusive. And most folks are not going to answer those honestly. I mean, if I was asked, do you use IV drugs, needles, you know, are you going to answer that if you're struggling with addiction? Absolutely not. And I think that the folks that we are trying, or who are most affected and we're trying to get housed, they need to be part of that conversation of what type of questions, or what is it that is needed to assess what their needs are for appropriate housing resources. You know, we have a long list of folks who are on permanent supportive housing, and we have a long list of folks who are on transitional or rapid rehousing. And the reality is, first of all, rapid rehousing and transitional housing funding has been cut over the years, and it continues to be cut. So there isn't going to be options like that. Second of all, individuals who may have scored within transitional or rapid rehousing often have higher barriers than they're disclosing. So even if they get into a transitional housing program, it's not necessarily the most appropriate. So how is that going to be successful if they don't have the support services needed? I will say, to speak on community partners and stuff, one thing that we have done in our local area is work with the coordinated entry to put on, I'm going to say the word wronging, but I'm just going to say it, native preference. We do offer culturally specific services. We abide by all fair housing, but we know that sometimes folks coming in or being referred to us do not want to be housed in a culturally specific housing program with those resources. And then we also know that there are community members, our relatives, who want to be in this type of support service housing. We do things a different way. And we really look to our Indigenous community for how do we provide support for them? How do we move them forward? How do we move our community forward? You know, we have Indigenous solutions to things that not only affect our community, but they affect the entire world. And our voices are starting to become heard, but we still have a long way to go. I also think that it's really important with community partners in any area, and specifically for tribal programs, to work very closely with their local county staff, and that's not always easy, and their local public housing authority. There are a lot of, how does my mom always say it, strategies that you can utilize to get somebody housed, as Cathee mentioned. Like, yeah, a lot of our relatives are doubled up and couch hopping, but we prompt them, don't use that language when you are being assessed. And is that wrong? Maybe. But the reality is that they're not going to be seen, or they're not going to be elevated on that housing list. And there's things within local housing authorities that our community members that are underserved do not know. They do not know their rights when applying for public housing. They do not, often they get denied for criminal history, or I once had somebody who was denied for a small amount of marijuana through public housing. And I thought to myself, you've got to be kidding me. This is like 4 years old, a small amount of marijuana, no other charges since then. And I started researching and looking into how can I appeal this, and how can I get a reasonable accommodation to pass their policies. And sure enough, after time I did, and they were housed here. But people don't know that. People don't read through housing authority policies. And I'm kind of a nerd. I like to do that stuff. I really like to look at property management and landlord laws. I love that stuff because I think it's important that we're educating our community members and letting them know what their rights are and advocating for them, because oftentimes they go into these programs and these systems and they just feel defeated. And I think we as a community overall need to all do that. And we need to stop being so siloed in the work that we do and come together to solve this issue. The one last thing I will say is I think that, you know, it all comes back to funding as well. We need more funding. you know, tribal lands have been chronically underfunded for decades with housing. And it is the same in urban areas. And we really need to advocate for more affordable, dignified housing, and let the individuals who are on the ground doing the direct service and working with these populations help navigate that and what that goes to.
Amen and ashe, Daryl. Thank you so much for that truth. Mike's dropped all over the place there. Cathee, did you have anything that you wanted to add before we move on to the next question?
Yeah, Daryl hit it right on with the native preference. Now, Little Earth Housing, we have what is called real Indian preference, like a housing authority on a reservation. We have that. AIM fought HUD and won that war in the early 80s. And that was a challenge. And really, they fought because HUD just got tired of fighting with us. But so we are the only housing authority or public housing in the nation that has real Indian preference in an urban area off the reservation. And it's so valuable. We have 78% of our residents that are Native American. Now, AICDC, American Community Development Corp, they built some housing here for elders and named it in Ojibwe, and yet they didn't get the Indian preference. And so here it is for our elders. And number one, like Daryl was saying about the qualifications, we can't get anybody that qualifies to move in that's an elder, that's a Native elder. And if they are, I have one elder, because I work extensively with our elder community here. And one of our elders actually qualified, got on the waiting list and got an apartment there. He was so saddened by the lack of programming, the lack of community within the, it's not Native Americans who live there. He was the exception, not the rule. And so he found no support and he actually got back on the wait because he lived here at Little Earth when he got on that waiting list. He actually got back on the waiting list, and 2 years later, he moved back to Little Earth from a very brand new building. New apartment, elevator. He's like, I would rather live in my community that cares about me, that has programs specifically for me, and that is, the Indian preference was huge to him. And the property management team came over here and said, hey, we've got openings. Nobody from here will go over there because there really isn't real Indian preference. They want to live within, we do think different. They do want community. They do want their culture. They do want to feel safe. And these are beautiful. And ours are old and you know, but it matters. So that Indian preference is huge. Now, my mom is Donna Fairbanks, and she has worked in Indian housing since the 70s. She was the first person who created an Indian, a Native American or American Indian education for home buyers. She got the first funding through the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, that they would actually borrow to Native people. So she was given awards for this. But she said, Cathee, we can get that. And she's 82 years old, lives on White Earth. And, but she's retired, but she's still my mentor. And so I told her about this community and that building that was supposed to be specifically for Native elders, and it isn't. And she said they could get it. They just have to do the work to get real preference, real Indian preference. Because then you'd have to go through all that waiting list, and then of course to make it to help folks qualify for what those rules and regs to get in is. That's it.
Thank you, Cathee. I'm going to step in for AsaleSol here for a moment because I think we lost her on our video, but I really appreciate you sharing that. I think one of the next questions that we really have are, we've talked to the serious gaps in the systems for coordinated entry. Just, they're not even gaps, they're just complete brokenness in the way that that's set up. And I was curious if maybe the question is additional gaps that you see in the system, places that need continued advocacy and attention. But maybe this is the question also for, like, where do we go from here? What more needs to be done in ensuring that there's affordable housing, safe housing, dignified housing in our Native communities, on our reservations, for our Native communities in urban spaces, and was curious your thoughts on that. And I'll start with you first, Cathee, and then Daryl. But would love to hear your thoughts.
I would think that in looking at funding, and again, it's really piggybacking onto what Daryl said about the funding, and we need more funding. And I look at the coordinated entry system. I look at the human services. I help folks apply for different programs, whether it's food or housing or medical assistance. And it is, again, it seems like there's so much red tape that goes into that it's working with our legislators, changing laws in how they're using these funds, that it seems like it's this big funnel. And by the time any of the funding goes down, there's so much eaten up with the administration of these funds that it leaves nothing for other folks. I was in a meeting once, and I won't get specific except for the fact that it was, we got to see funds for training and technical assistance for Indian country, okay? And they were from HUD, and they were specifically for Native American communities. I got to see this budget. It was $14 million for training and technical assistance. By the time HUD took their cut, it was down to $4 million. So to administer $14 million they started with, it went down. I couldn't believe my eyes. I was looking at this real, it was like 3,900,000, blah, 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 but it was 14 to start. And nobody said anything. All the others in the meeting, I was new, so I was just like, because I know that within, let's say I get a grant from HUD to do training and technical assistance, I can only use 20% of those for administering those, for admin. 20%. So if I got 4 million, 2 times 4, I can use $800,000 to run this program. How did it get from 14 million? So that's what I see. I see it getting eaten up all up here. It's this funnel, and it's, so how do we change those laws? I guess that's all I would say in my limited knowledge.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cathee. And sorry that I lost you all there for a minute. Daryl, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would like to add, but before I touch, and this kind of touches on both, there's a question in the chat from Matthew about, if you heard correctly, some people do not want culturally specific housing. Can anyone address the encampments in South Minneapolis and the challenges associated with getting people into emergency shelters? So I think the first thing is, one, there isn't enough emergency shelters and places for folks to go. I also think that it comes down to how we do the work that we're doing. So if you look at Minneapolis and how they started just no notice to people living in encampments, just started taking down tents, throwing all of their stuff away, not even having outreach workers there to help these folks that were displaced to begin with, to do any type of support services. The way in which they did it was very, inhumane, and it just contributed to the problems, the challenges. Now, what we're seeing in South St. Paul is they have this, or in St. Paul, is that they have a similar crisis with homelessness, but their approach is completely different. They work with outreach workers. They give them advance notice that these encampments are going to be shut down so that those providers can go in and work with city staff to de-escalate situations and tensions and help people relocate, not bringing in police who come in full force and tear down these people's homes. These are their homes. I think the other thing in the way that we do things is we need to start figuring out, why are people in these encampments? What are their barriers? What do they need in order to be successful? And, I think Mike Gozzi spoke on this. And he said, looking at more data, like, what are their barriers to accessing housing? And how can we help the city to manage these encampments in size before they get too big and they become unsafe places and places where drug dealers and traffickers flock to? Like, how can we address that? But nobody's asking us that. These cities or counties are just going in, saying it's illegal to have a tent. A tent is not housing, all of this, but there's a different way we can do that, and we can keep these communities safe. You just have to be willing to do that. We need to implement more mental health units in our outreach. We need to have more support services. It's just really frustrating to me because I don't think the solution is so, to me, it feels like common sense. It really does. And when everything comes in with systems and politics, everything gets blurred. But if we want to have resolutions to these issues, we as a community need to come together. We need to be the louder voice in the room than anybody else, because we can resolve these things. We can minimize them. And, one thing Duluth has started looking at is, okay, we get these encampments in certain areas very regularly. Well, why aren't we going into them and providing mental health services and chemical dependency services? And why aren't we creating places where people can shower, that our relatives are living outdoors, where they can shower or get a meal? In the wintertime, how many folks are we losing every year because of the cold? Because there is not enough shelters. And even, warming centers are only open from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. Where do those folks go for the rest of the day? Because every time they go somewhere where, and I will just say it, where most of it, tourism comes from here in our area, the city just goes in and tears down their homes. There's no resolution to it. They're just tearing them down. Guess what? We're going to find a new place and they're going to set up there. And our outreach workers will still continue to go out and provide food and resources. But I think nationwide and statewide, we need to do that together and look at what's worked in other areas. And that's all I'll say.
No, that's great, Daryl. And that actually takes me to my last question for the two of you, which is, as we head into this new legislative session, post our midterm elections, are there policies that you all are working on, that you are aware of, that you would like us and your audience to advocate for alongside of you? And Cathee, I will start with you.
That's a really good question. I think I'm just too new in this area to answer that. Other than what we've discussed in the sense of more mental health, because what Daryl just said about coming into an encampment here, 28th and Bloomington, 1 month ago, we had a huge encampment there of lots of our folks. that had, it was a tent city, and it was blocked off by police, fire trucks. Nobody was given. They came in with bulldozers and just tore the place down, left all these people. So it's really looking at funding to get more outreach, to help to figure out more. I mean, we have so many churches, so many. Yes, I've got the handbook for the homeless, and it's got great resources, but we need it times a million. And to really look at these folks, because here, especially in South Minneapolis, there are, I mean, I come to work and I am dodging bullets, literally. There are shootings and murders and shootings and killings and overdose and all of this stuff. It's not reported anywhere, let alone the police to come, if you call the police. So it's just it's a question that's too big for me right now. I just don't know, but I just keep plugging along, and who is in front of me, I'll do whatever I can to help.
Well, I would say, Cathee, that what I heard in your response is a call for fundraising, for support from foundations, and I heard you explicitly name churches, and to use their creative and financial resources toward solutions. The reality is that my question was about policy, and Daryl, I'll definitely turn it to you in a moment, but the reality is that it takes more than just one avenue to solve these issues. And so fundraising and community support are just as vital as things that we can do to change and shift policy. Daryl.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't an easy question. I think funding in general is always going to be an issue, and how it's dispersed within our community. But I think it's dead on. It's looking at not just, funding to address housing disparities or lack of housing, but all the support services that go into that. We need more mental health programming. We need more chemical dependency programming. We need more, I mean, anything. We need all of it. It doesn't all work if it's not all there together. And, there's this new money coming out, but, how do you prioritize what's of most value? Is it the chicken or the egg first, in essence? And I think that as communities, you need to start looking at who are your supporters, because those foundations and those private donors, and even getting local, county support, that helps to raise your voice to state levels, to federal levels. And in all honesty, they really get to see that aspect of the work that we do, and then the needs that are happening within our community. AICHO historically has primarily been funded by foundations and various grants. We have gotten federal funding and we've gotten state funding, but those are always more challenging, and so that leads to another aspect. Stop creating such barriers for us to access this housing and to apply for these RFPs, because I will write 10 grants for 10,000 over writing one grant for 100,000 that I know already they're going to look at it and shut me down. And you know what? Whether it's 10 grants at 10,000, I still got $100,000. So, and there's less restrictions on how I use that to support my community.
Yeah, that's really helpful feedback. And I would really, we are, as we head into this session, I think it's just really important to have your voices a part of any statewide housing initiatives. You named it very early on, Daryl, that housing has to come first. It's literally impossible for people to transform their own lives if they don't have stability, if they don't have shelter, they don't know that they're safe. Very much to your point, Cathee. And so, yes, there's a lot of issues on the table as we think about this surplus funding that our state has held on to in this last year. But we know that, housing is the door opener. It's literally the pathway to stabilizing every other aspect of an individual's life. So Really appreciate that. And yes, just to name, I was reminded just to name that one of our big pushes here at Urban Homeworks is an initiative called Bring It Home Minnesota, which is working to do just that, to stabilize folks that are making below 50% of the area median income, to ensure that they do not have to pay more than 30% of that income toward their housing. This is a statewide initiative. It isn't everything, but it certainly is a great start. And so hopefully we can continue to build our efforts. And I just love everything that you have said about coming together, Daryl. I think that that is also why we are doing this panel today, because that is essential. So before we wrap up, I really want the audience to know exactly how they can continue to support your work and your organizations. And so my last few questions are just for an opportunity really for you to share your giving pages with the audience, because fundraising is key to continuing the hard work that we all are doing. I want to give you that opportunity. And if there's any other ways that folks can support the work directly beyond fundraising, please share that. And then my very last question for you is just how we here at Urban Homeworks can be partners in working on this issue and supporting Indigenous housing and home ownership in the future. And so, Daryl, I am going to start with you.
Well, I think I just want to say thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel today. And I think this is the first start, is having conversations like this. You know, these conversations are not comfortable for people, but they need to be had. And we need to do it in a diverse range of, you know, different populations, and have these really intense conversations and delve into it. And we need to support each other's work, whether that is, you know, working on initiatives together, whether that is supporting the work that we are doing, whether that is collaborating on something and raising our voices up. I really, you know, I've said this, I feel like a broken record, but we have to come together if we are going to put any sort of dent and bring all of our lives forward in a positive way. And until we do that, until we stop being in this siloed, or, you know, and sometimes it's the nature of work where we're fighting for this funding, but instead of fighting for it, why aren't we sharing it? Why aren't we sharing our resources as community members? Because our hearts are all into this. And we can accomplish a lot more if we do that. So thank you very much.
Ashe to all of that. Thank you so much, Daryl. And feel free, if you haven't, put in the chat where folks can go to donate to your work. Cathee, take us home. Oh, you are muted. Yeah.
You know, it's really hard to not just reiterate everything that Daryl says. I just want to say ditto, ditto, and ditto, and ditto. Daryl, you're an amazing woman, and I can't wait to meet you and all of you for allowing us to be here and to talk about this. I will put in, it's, you know, there it is, donate to Little Earth. Thank you, Katie, to just continue these conversations, to be a part of this conversation, to partner up with everybody instead of, because we're all going out, a lot of times we're going out for the same funding. And so I liked everything that Daryl said. She has such a voice and she's so knowledgeable on this. And so I feel like I'm in the presence of somebody who I want to continue and learn from and grow and continue to have these conversations. You know, in speaking about like the funding itself, when we do get private, because I've helped write a couple of grants here. And yes, there are so many barriers within state grants or federal funding. that with private donors, we get to dream, we get to utilize the money in such different ways. And I found it really interesting where it was like for food, oh, we can only buy indigenous foods. What does indigenous foods mean? We're here in the 21st century, so we can only buy wild rice and blueberries in Buffalo. I mean, those are all beautiful things, but we live here and today, and we use other products that doesn't. So anyway, I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you both so much. It was such a wonderful conversation, providing some insight into ways that we can partner and ways that we can grow our fight for those that have been historically marginalized and disenfranchised by these systems, particularly in housing. So I look forward to connecting more with both of you moving forward, particularly around policy initiatives, but also just in the on-the-ground day-to-day work of providing more housing for our communities. So thank you all so much, and thank you for joining us, audience. We are grateful for your time.
Thank you.